My name is David Thomas. I'm the director of the Kinghorn Cancer Centre here in Sydney. Clinical trials are where we find out how drugs work and where to use them best. They're ultimately where all drugs come from. In the cancer space, at any rate, there are hundreds of clinical trials that are going on at any one point in time. We're fortunate in some ways that there are so many drugs being developed by pharmaceutical industry. Every year, new drugs, new targets are being developed, and that's where the future of drug treatments have come from. That's why we've made such enormous progress in cancer treatments, is because of the development of drugs through clinical trials that have made a difference to the lives of patients. Clinical trials are generally thought of in three phases. You can imagine that when a drug is first emerges from the laboratory to be used in a person, we don't even know how to use it, what dose to use, what schedule to use. And in what is called a phase 1 study, typically we very carefully introduce the drug into a small group of patients, trying to find out what a safe and tolerable dose of the drug is. In phase 2, once we have that information, we test the drug to see whether it will work. And in typically between, say, 24 and maybe up to 80 patients, we find out exactly how well the drug is working and whether it's got some promise for patients compared to what we're currently offering patients in clinical practice. And then in phase 3, we do the formal test of that. We do typically a randomized study where patients are randomized either to getting the current standard of care or they receive the new drug. And from a phase 3 study, of course, we work out whether the new drug is better than what we currently offer, and hopefully, eventually, that drug will become the new standard of care for treatment. Each clinical trial is one of those phases. So typically a patient who's been exposed to a drug in phase 1 would not be exposed to the same drug in phase 2 or phase 3. The other thing to bear in mind is that it takes up to 10 years to develop a drug. So it takes maybe 2 years to develop the information in a phase 1, and then that's carried on into studies which might take 2 to 5 years in phase 2. And it's only once you get that information that you do the really big study, which might itself take 5 to 10 years. You can see that drug development's a very slow process, frustratingly slow.
Hi, I'm Richard Vines. I'm the Chief Executive of Rare Cancers Australia. The major benefit of clinical trials is the opportunity for a patient to access the latest medicines. Typically, for a medicine to become available on the PBS takes several years. In the meantime, the only way to access that is by either being on a clinical trial or paying potentially tens of thousands of dollars to access it. So it's a really good opportunity for someone to get access to the newest and latest technologies. Clinical trials are regulated by peer review, essentially, in that when someone wants to run a clinical trial, they have to present the content of the trial and the processes they want to go through to the ethics committee of the hospital or the medical centre that they're running at, and that ethics committee, which is comprised of senior clinicians and researchers, will go through and then finally work out whether it's a reasonable thing for them to run. It means that they are always structured in a way that is safe, respectful of the patient. It's really rigorous, and Australia has one of the best reputations in the world for running clinical trials. I think sometimes people think clinical trials are experimental and nobody wants to be a lab rat. But that's not what clinical trials are. They have a different purpose. There's an enormous amount of work done on a treatment before it's tested on any patient. And in the initial test on patients, a phase 1 clinical trial, it's purely done to ensure that the drug is safe and that patients are closely monitored. Then in phase 2 trials, we try to work out whether the drug is actually working. And then in phase 3 trials, we try to see how much better it's working than the current treatment. Particularly for rare or less common cancer patients, where we've got so many new treatments coming down the pipeline, they're not yet available through the general PBS, they're not part of standard of care, and sometimes if you don't have any other options, it's a really good thing to contemplate.
It is a fundamental principle of the ethical conduct of any research that any participant fully understands the risks and benefits to them of taking part. In some cases we don't understand a great deal, but that's made clear that we're trying to find out that information. In some cases you'll see this very long list of potential side effects because we really like to make sure that patients fully understand any range, any possible side effect to which they might be exposed. In all cases, patients are fully informed before they decide to take part. If a patient does experience side effects, typically the doctor who's conducting the clinical trial will make a judgment about whether those side effects are severe, life-threatening, or whether they're minor. And then they have a range of options. They can either continue the drug because the drug is proving effective on the cancer and perhaps the side effects are worthwhile. They could decide to reduce the dose of the drug to see if they could minimize the side effects while still maintaining the effectiveness of the drug. Or in severe circumstances, they could stop the treatments altogether. And then they can either restart them if there's some evidence of benefit, or the patient might come off the trial altogether. In all circumstances, your doctor should speak to you about all of those options and come up with a decision that's best for you and your circumstances. Usually clinical trials will be conducted for breast cancer or for lung cancer or for prostate cancer and so forth. What that means is that many patients with rare and less common cancers, of course, while there may be plenty of trials for breast cancer or prostate cancer or lung cancer, there may be very few trials for their particular cancer type. Other considerations that might limit your eligibility include how fit you are. This is very important because when people become very sick as the cancer advances, they may become too sick to be able to tolerate any form of treatment, let alone one that has an unknown range of side effects. And what that typically means is that if a person is not self-caring in respect of showering, dressing, feeding themselves, or in bed more than half the day, typically it's not a good idea to go on to a clinical trial.
When patients are participating in clinical trials, they typically are at a small number of locations, and if you don't live in that location, then you may have to travel. And sometimes there will be a situation where the people running the trial will want you to stay in close proximity so they can monitor how the drug is affecting you and make sure that you're safe and well. Travelling can be arduous. Organisations like ours, like Rare Cancers Australia, work with patients to help them get to trials, get accommodation, and make it as painless as possible. That's one of the services that we offer patients. There's typically no cost. Sometimes travel costs can be a challenge. If that is a burden for someone, then they should talk to someone like Rare Cancers Australia because we can help in one way or another. We can find accommodation and we can sometimes subsidise accommodation. Our objective as an organisation is to make sure that people get to the treatment that they need. Cancer is a big enough stress without adding financial stress on top of it, so we try to help wherever we can. Clinical trials are about collecting data on the response of patients, and so typically there can be quite a bit of paperwork, there can be quite a lot of information, and it's always good to have somebody with you to actually guide you through the process, and someone who can remember. I don't know about anybody else, but if I go in to see a doctor, I sometimes forget the questions and I sometimes certainly forget the answers. So having somebody with me is always useful, and that's always recommended.